Join us now for Viewpoint, a series of programs produced in the studio of the Rosicrucian Order, AMARC, an educational cultural organization located in San Jose, California. Explore with us the fields of science, philosophy, and the psychic nature of man through insights that reveal normally hidden truths. Your host for Viewpoint is Christy Knudsen, staff member with the Rosicrucians.
Tasty, I hope. I like it. And I'm going to be on in one. Hello, I'm Christy Knudsen, your host for Viewpoint. Today we're going to be talking with Dr. George Buletza, director of the Rosicrucian Research Laboratory, about his research on thought processes and on what has been called the triune brain. Dr. Buletza is a neuroscientist and was formerly on staff at the University of California at Berkeley and also at Stanford University, where he completed some 10 years of active research examining the nervous system and especially focusing on the brain. Today we're going to be benefiting from all this research as we do some interesting poking around in here to see just exactly what makes us tick. As a matter of fact, George has told me earlier that sometimes I think like a reptile, using my reptile brain. Now, frankly, this makes me a little bit nervous, and I'm planning on finding out as we go along whether I should really be worried about that or not. George, welcome to Viewpoint.
Well, thank you, Christy. It's a pleasure for me to be here, too.
I'm happy to have you. George, in looking over some of your past research at Berkeley and Stanford, I am very impressed by the scope of research and the emphasis you placed on the brain, looking at the brain structure. Now with the Rosicrucian Research Laboratory, you are also focusing on the brain, but looking at it in terms of thought, of mind, as a tool to think with. This is a lot of time to spend looking at the brain. Why brain research? Why is this significant to me and to the average person on the street?
Oh, Christy, I think everyone has an interest in how it is we're able to do what we do. What is it about our own nature that allows us to think, that allows us to have certain kinds of behavior that is different from other animals? You start talking about the brain and people's eyes light up and they want to know, just what it is about themselves that lets them do what they do.
And what kinds of behavior have you found when you're looking at the brain?
Well, there's many different ways that we can look at the brain. I think one of the fruitful ways that we might look at it is in the way that Paul MacLean, a neuroscientist, has looked at it. He has suggested that this brain is actually divided in 3 parts. Depending on where in this brain you look, we can start out in evolution with the very centermost portion of this brain. I have a picture here for you. And as we look at this centralmost portion here, this was associated with reptiles, with the R complex or reptilian brain.
This is where my reptile thinking comes in.
And this is where your reptile thinking comes in. I brought with us here a reptile. This is Theo.
Hello, Theo. How are you?
I'd like to introduce you to Theo, yes. And I'd like us to think about Theo for a moment and just look at him. And if you were to describe Theo, what kind of characters, what kind of impression does this fellow make on you?
Well, he makes quite a distinct impression. He's rather firmly footed. And he's got spines and armor, and he looks sort of stuffy and fixed.
Right, and he would walk with a very reptile-like, stodgy, mechanical motion and movement. They can move quite fast at times.
But it's still in a sort of mechanistic way.
Okay, well, there is a part of our brain, this innermost portion, that tends to behave very much like a reptile. That is, it's stodgy, it's fixed, it uses certain kinds of behaviors over and over again, even if they're not productive. These behaviors are very concerned with security, with dealing with threats. We get into a threatened situation, and we start behaving in an armored, protective, defensive kind of way.
I have the terrible feeling that this is where we begin describing how I think like a reptile sometimes. It certainly is true that all of us tend to react to threats in a very stiff fashion. The minute we feel threatened, we begin looking at our territory, we begin sort of guarding, and we get vengeful too, don't we? We sort of get interested in getting revenge on people who do things.
This kind of behavior has been characterized as being reptilian in its nature. Also, if you've ever been on a committee and you watch people getting upset at a committee, I want it this way, kind of thing.
Yes, I've seen that kind of behavior.
You've seen that kind of behavior. That's considered to be a bit reptilian also.
George, now I want to continue looking at how I'm a reptile, but I'm beginning to feel uncomfortable. You've got to bail me out of this, George. Surely there is an alternative way I have of acting. I'm not all reptile. Is there some counterbalancing sort of approach that I have available to me? I hope.
Well, I'll think about it. And fortunately, there is another part of the brain which surrounds this reptilian portion, and this is called the mammalian brain. And it just follows around the R complex. And this has a number of structures associated with it, which we might discuss a little bit. But you know, where that reptilian brain was concerned with dealing with threats, and either would be very aggressive or would run away into a hole someplace and so therefore build up its security. Maybe it would even hoard things, like the old dragon, the old image of the dragon that would hoard
his gold
and so on, like that, right? This is reptilian. But now, the mammal has another way of dealing with security and threat.
Well, you're saying that when the reptile crawled up on land, then, he had to deal with some different circumstances, so this mammalian brain developed.
This is the idea. We don't want to be
simplistic. It's simplistic
or Lamarckian in our philosophy. But nonetheless, we have a mammalian brain which gives us a lot more options than the reptilian brain. The reptile has basically one way to respond, and you deal with a threatened reptile, and you can be fairly sure in what ways it will respond.
It's predictable.
It's very predictable. It's a good word for it. A mammal is a lot less predictable. But getting back to the mammal and the way that it can deal with the need for security is a process called nurturing. The mammalian brain, there's a need to be nurtured and to nurture others. And if you think back on your own life, those instances, maybe when your mother or father gave you nurturing kinds of behavior, you feel very secure.
Well, we can think this way about animals. People who like dogs and cats and animals, for instance, do have this. They're cuddly.
Yes.
And they like to be cuddled, and they like to give affection back. That certainly is not reptilian. One would not cuddle a reptile.
One would neither cuddle a reptile. They're kind of cold-blooded, not very warm,
exactly.
Right? But in addition, we don't find reptiles, to my way of thinking, I can't think of any instance of a reptile that keeps a pet. Now, you'll find it with mammals in general, not only just humans, but mammals often will keep pets.
Mammals will keep pets?
Sure, of other species.
Really?
You ever see a dog raise a cat?
Oh,
or
that's
vice
true.
versa,
That's
and
true.
so on?
That's true.
Or these friendships between a dog and a bird, or other things of this sort.
That's true.
Yeah. There's something very characteristic of this mammalian brain is that it's more creative. in coming up with all these different options, it tolerates ambivalence much greater than reptilian-type behavior. We find that it's more explorative in nature. It's joyful. It gives us these behaviors and feelings of happiness and creativity.
I have a mental image of an otter, or again of a little animal playing and gambling around the countryside,
Right.
And there is a playful aspect to it. They seem to enjoy the concept of having fun, which I can't imagine a reptile ever having fun. They would be sitting there back in their cave hoarding their gold, right, and would not be out there gambling around and having fun.
We don't think of reptiles as going out on adventures as we would perhaps an otter.
Exactly.
To have a fun experience. This mammalian brain has a particular structure. We have a model of it here called the limbic system. And this particular system, perhaps more than any other part of this mammalian brain, is associated with things like memory, maps, making maps of where we are and how to get from here to there.
Perhaps
how to get from...
you could show us.
Sure.
Can you point that out for us?
Well, this here is the limbic system. It fits into the brain right along here. And if we turn this around, this lobe right down here at the bottom, it's called the temporal lobe. And this lobe down here, the major portion of the limbic system fits in that lobe. This portion here is called the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is part that seems to be especially associated with memories, initiating memories. In fact, there was a very famous neurosurgeon that would place a scalpel on the temporal lobe or an electrode, and the person would immediately begin to get complete memories of things that happened in their life, and it would include the smell and the taste, the touch, the sight and the sound, and it would be just like they were reliving the experience.
Now, this sort of thing, now you mentioned that this, the limbic system, the hippocampus area there, has to do with memory. But I think you also mentioned it has to do with spatial mapping. In other words, the mammal, in dealing, mammals tend to have a much wider reptiles live in very fixed territories. They come out of their hole in the ground, they sort around in their little area, and they go back to their hole in the ground. Whereas mammals tend to deal in great pieces of area.
That's right.
They move around a lot, so they've had to learn how to find their way around in different areas, and it's this particular limbic system, this hippocampal system that has to do with spatial mapping.
And allows us to do this. We go into a new building and we thread our way through the maze of rooms and halls and things of this sort, and we can get our way out again, hopefully.
Hopefully.
Yeah. And that allows us to do that.
Now, you know, George, this is sort of ringing a little bell in my mind. You're discussing two different kinds of behavior. The reptile behavior, which is rather fixed, rather cold, and so on, as opposed to the mammalian or the limbic behavior, let's call it, which is a little more open and playful. Now, mystics tend to look at the world through what we have, through the triangle. And let me take my picture of the triangle out here. We can look at the world as manifesting according to what mystics have called the law of the triangle. And as I understand it, the law of the triangle is defined as thesis blending with the antithesis combines to create a synthesis. The thesis and antithesis seem to be at odds with each other, but when they combine, they form a third condition, a synthesis, which is somewhat more than the sum of the parts. Now, I'm hearing in this description of the action of the brain that we might have the first 2 points of the triangle. Am I
the duality.
correct? The duality.
Right.
Now, this is a terrible situation to be in because these two kinds of behavior appear to be in conflict with each other. George, how do we resolve this? Where is the third point of the triangle?
Well, fortunately,
Aha, there
with
is.
the brain, there is a third point here, at least we can look at it that way, and that is the cerebral cortex sitting here at the very top. And this part of the brain is sometimes called the neocortex or neo-mammalian brain. Going back to our diagram, this would surround the mammalian brain. So we have our triune structure, according to Paul MacLean. This part of the brain here, the cortex, probably more than any other part of the brain, could be associated with what we tend to think of as that part which makes us what we are, so to speak. It's the part which allows us to use reason, the power of reason, to evaluate, to appreciate the world in which we live in. But most important, in terms of the model that we're talking about here, the cortex balances the reptilian brain and the mammalian brain and allows us to choose, just what behaviors we're going to give our attention to.
Ah, I see. So instead of reacting reflexively, there's a stimulus in the environment and we react with either a reptilian behavior or a mammalian behavior. It's this neocortex, the neo-mammalian brain, that can choose which of those behaviors is appropriate.
That's right.